This is the No Stroke Podcast with your co-hosts David Dancero and Michael Garrow, helping you to support and thrive in life after stroke. Their podcast is designed for educational and community support purposes only and should not replace medical treatment and guidance of your own health professional team.
Welcome to season 3 of the No Stroke Podcast. 3 welcomes, and I'd like to say it is so good to be back for season 3 and have my esteemed co-host Michael Garrow with me. Michael, what's the crack?
Yeah, I miss it. I miss the crack. That's what I miss, man. We had some good times with doing this show. So yeah, we were on a bit of a hiatus, getting back into the swing of things now, just like my workout routine, you know. I knew that was going to be a topic of conversation as well. So
yeah, let's just get that over with now, because that's on my list. Hold on, because I can check right now. Oh, Mike, nice job. Wait.
For our listeners, he's looking at his Apple Watch. So Dave and I compete against each other.
We're neck and neck today, Mike.
Hey, I'm going out for a long walk after this. So
you know what happened is you probably
might have a beer like after that or in between the walks, but yeah, it's fine.
You're back at it, so you can have multiple. It's a long weekend. And I apologize, I muted your notification, so I didn't know you were working out. I hope you're not muting mine, because I've been busy too. So
yeah. I mean I get it. You want to mute me, it's just so you don't feel bad when you see me completing workouts and you're sitting watching TV. But yeah, it's great to be back. It's great to be back. It's like we explained on the last show, we really want to do something right with this show, and I think we're off to a good start in the first 3 seasons. But when we're thinking about kind of what's next, we've had some time to really sit back and think through that. So we'll be inviting on in our next, I believe it's going to be our next episode, gentleman Dan Kendall, who runs the Healthcare Podcast Network. We'll talk through it more and kind of what that means for us and some of the work that we'll be doing. But I think it's an exciting next step for us. And maybe also an in-person pod coming in the next couple of months as well here, when now that it's summertime, got to get a bit more free time to travel as well. So
we have to make that happen. We have to. We can meet a meeting point halfway by somewhere near the coast, near one of the beaches, and I've got a little microbrewery halfway that I've already got picked out. So we just have to make it happen. All right. Let's we finally have a great guest coming on, because these asynchronous last 2 episodes, they're no fun. We get the in the news done, but tell me what it's like recording by yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's too much talking to yourself. I mean, I don't know how these, the guys on like sports radio or something, that they could literally just talk to themselves for like 3 hours nonstop. It's an art. It really is. I don't like doing it, but this is a better flow. You and I, being able to bounce off each other, and then obviously bringing in a guest. It just nobody wants to listen to us talk the whole time. Like, let's get the expert.
Let's get it going. So let's keep in season 3. Let's keep with the in the news. There's folks that have commented they like that feature of the podcast, so we always set the stage in the news. In the news this week for me, if you don't mind, do you want me to just jump in quick first, and then
let's hear it.
Me and first and quick? I don't know if those 3 things are quick for me, but I'm going to try to keep this to a minute. I attended a webinar this week that was a joint venture between the World Stroke Academy and the American Heart Association, and it was on guidelines for stroke rehab and recovery. And it was when the replay becomes available, I'm going to post it, maybe do a blog post, but put it up in the show notes as well. It was really well done. And the main thing that I took away from it was they're looking at creating something called the International Stroke Recovery and Rehab Alliance. And the reason they're doing that is because there's been a lot of momentum over the last couple of years, and we've talked about it on the podcast. We've improved guidelines and got on the same page with prevention and acute stroke treatment. but we haven't done too much, and it's fragmented when it comes to recovery and long-term recovery and management of best outcomes. So they want to create a go-to place essentially for researchers, but also there was a mix of academics. But on that webinar, there were a lot of stroke patients and, that really, and caregivers that really wanted to express their voice. So they were hopeful that they were going to be invited into this membership. And the answer to that was yes. I've applied, and right now it's currently free. And the goal is to make it active and build working groups. So, hopefully we can talk more about that as I learn more, and maybe we can get more involved in that. So that was a big, I thought a big positive in the stroke news for me this week. So how about yourself, Mike?
Cool. Thanks for shouting that out. Yeah, and hopefully we could get, some more involvement later in the summer. For me, last weekend, Meg and I, we went to an event here in New York City that was ran by our previous guest, Kyle Mellencamp. So it was his brain bar that he titles this, and it's really just like an intimate gathering of brain injury survivors, and then he kind of makes a theme for the evening, and then brings in experts to kind of talk through. So really cool group of folks, a super nice venue in Soho. It was meant to be, I think, at some terrace in Brooklyn, but it was kind of weather impeding last weekend. So he linked up with this woman who runs a pop-up mental health bar, and beautifully set up, like has lots of grant money in it. So it was a cool, like, intimate place to go. And there's probably 30, 40 folks, or I would say close to 40
Wow.
participants there. All kind of a range of ages, range of different, conditions. So, primarily a lot of stroke survivors, but there were some other people in there with different types of acquired brain injuries, and, had a bit of time to kind of mingle at the start, and then went into a couple interesting conversations through the keynotes. So the first was a exercise done by this Spanish researcher, and she's been kind of highlighted through Jill Bolte-Taylor and her work, and it's all around like the arts and rehab. So did a cool exercise with her, and then moved into who actually sponsored the event, Modus Nova, which is a rehab device, and I think we're going to have one of their co-founders on later this season as well, just to talk through their device and kind of how they're building their therapeutic. And then it was capped off by a neurologist who spoke to kind of the gamification and community building within the rehab space. So trying to make rehab fun and getting the reps up. So it again, really interesting kind of lineup of speakers, and great to see Kyle, be able to pull this off. I know he's been doing it for a number of years, but I'm just happy I was able to get to one. And it was also nice. I think, this is the first time Megan really got to be in a room with other folks like her mom, and for her, I think it was an evening where, you got to see like, hey, there's a lot of other people out here just like my mom in different parts. Everyone kind of has their own thing going on, but it's nice to kind of see other folks in that position. So yeah, it was nice evening overall. And I believe he's going to put a recording up. He did it live, but we'll try to grab the recording of it and put it in the show notes for people.
That would be great. Hey, thanks for sharing that. And I have to ask, did you make any arrangements to get some hoop date in with Kyle? There was kind of some back and forth on his episode. Yeah.
I think, we'll have an epic battle of pig in the next couple of weeks. We're planning actually to go down. There's a park in East Village that Kevin Durant, he like funded and built it all up. I played there last weekend, last Sunday actually, before I went. So him and I were talking.
All right.
We'll get there.
Am I going to get the invite? You saw my basketball in that last night. I sent you the photo.
I'll hold down the basketball for us. You could, if we ever get a hockey guy to come on, I'll let you challenge him in a hockey. That would be for the better. I'm trying. I think Celtics game 3. My son and I are not big basketball fans, admittedly, but I know I texted you. I said, "What's going on?" I don't understand the
the big windows with the scores. Sometimes, for me as a playoff hockey game, that 20, when I text you, is a 20-point spread. That would be like a 15-1 playoff hockey game. And like, how would you get into it? So I'm trying to learn it.
I'd say it'd be more of like a 4-1 hockey game. Like a 20-point swing is actually, they happen often.
Okay.
Yeah. More often than you'd think.
Because of the three. I'm starting to learn that the three is
the pace of the game, the 3-point shot for sure.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the talent is just crazy. But yeah, it hasn't been the series most people thought. But
okay. So
let's see. I think the Celtics will be in it. They have game 6 tonight to try to make the final. So
but that's a long way of telling the folks that I'm not invited on the courts in New York. Okay. No.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So with that said, you want to get right to introing our guests you were bringing on? You want to do those honors?
Sure. Yeah. I was just trying to wait for the sirens to pass here.
Hey, that's Mike. That's part of the crack, and that's part of the crack in New York City. When are you going to explain that term for me?
The crack. It doesn't need to be explained. Right? You either know it or you don't.
Well, I was trying to impress you with the crack because I
was blown away. Yeah, we'll jump into it. I think we have I'm working on getting an Irish guest on here.
Okay. All right.
So we'll dive into what the crack is once we get the Irish guest.
Perfect. On. Okay. So there's nothing illegal for anyone listening. It's Mike moved to New York. It's all good, but it's just a term I learned on the Digital Therapeutics podcast and with those Irish roots. So I feel like I'm kind of like I'm hip now, but
all right.
All right, go ahead.
You don't have to feel you are hip. You are hip. All right. So yeah, let's jump into it. So this week we are speaking to Jordyn Sims Pierce. She is the Vice President and Clinical Operations Development Lead at Constant Health Therapy. So Constant Therapy is a digital therapeutic in speech and language therapy space. They've been around since about
2013, 14,
2013, 2014. Yeah. Kind of spun out of BU, but Jordyn will walk us through kind of their origin story and how Jordyn got involved. But for us, it was our first aphasia focused episode. So I think we're going to be trying to do a couple more of these. It's an area that is often a big point of interest, for many stroke survivors. So I know we talk a lot about movement and exercise and different types of therapy, but we're excited for this chat. I think it was a great way to kind of lead into a couple episodes on this topic.
For sure.
And Jordyn is a tech geek like us, so she has her hands in a few different pies. So she's also the founder and director of Pierce Speech and Language Therapy Center out in the Berkshires of Western Mass. So yeah, interesting chat, and we'll be back soon for another episode. But until then, enjoy this one and stay warm, stay cool, folks, because it's a hot one here in New York today.
Yeah, and enjoy the long weekend with an episode of the podcast. Right, long weekend coming up.
Absolutely.
Let's bring her in.
Hi, Jordyn. Welcome to the No Stroke Podcast.
Oh, thank you guys for having me.
It is a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So we are sitting down. Jordyn promised us when we were setting this up that she'd give us a nice Berkshire's backdrop of her what's now office out in Lenox, Mass. But why don't you, for the listeners, kind of give us a bit of a taste of where you are right now, and what's gotten you to where you are today with Constant Therapy and some of the work that you're doing.
You bet. So I'm here in Lenox. It's in the Berkshires. There's some very nice trees in the background here for you. And actually, this is my private practice office. I'm a private practice speech and language pathologist and also assistive technology specialist. And I work with patients across the lifespan. And in addition to that, I'm the vice president of clinical operations and development for Constant Therapy, which is a app company. We have a program that works on speech, language, and cognitive therapy tasks, and that's available across platforms. And I'm excited to chat with you guys about it in more detail.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting background you have, and when I was looking at your experience, like it sounded like you started as a secondary English teacher. So you're a teacher prior to making the leap into speech and language therapy. Is that correct?
That is correct. So I actually majored in creative writing as an undergrad, and was trying to figure out how to apply that to the real world, and teaching seemed like a great fit. So I taught 8th grade English for 2 years with Teach for America down in Washington, D.C. And after that, I then went back to graduate school for speech pathology. And it's all history from there. So I went to Boston University, graduated from there and worked in a private practice for a while. And then I've worked at, outpatient clinics, inpatient acute settings, and now in private practice again.
Very nice. Very nice. So now on No Stroke Podcast, obviously we have a focus within the stroke community, but, for us, we know aphasia is impacted across the spectrum, right? You don't just have to have a stroke to have this happen to you. So for our listeners, and this is the first episode, we're really taking a dive into aphasia. So it might be good to kind of start and just lay a foundation of the science. What is happening when someone has the impact of aphasia?
Absolutely. Great place to start. So, when I think of the brain, it's really a fascinating part of the body that we don't fully understand yet as a scientific community, and we're constantly learning more. But basically, when you think of the brain, each part of your brain is responsible for a different task. And in the case of aphasia, it means that that specific part of the brain that's responsible for language has been impacted in some way. So that could be from a stroke. It could be from a traumatic brain injury. There are other types of aphasia as well. There's primary progressive aphasia, which is more akin to a form of dementia that is progressive. So it will, increase over time in its severity, whereas more acquired aphasia, it has to do with stroke and traumatic brain injury, and that we often see really great improvement from. And part of the reason for that is neuroplasticity. So if the part of the brain that's damaged by that stroke or that traumatic brain injury was responsible for language, then you might see that impact of aphasia. And really, it's loss of language. One of the slogans of aphasia is loss of language, not intellect. So it's really that, specifically those language hubs of your brain have been impacted. So that might impact the way that you're able to find the word you want. It might impact the way that you're able to read, write, understand what someone's saying to you. And the really incredible thing, though, is because of neuroplasticity, the brain is able to change, and it can't, completely heal or recover those damaged areas, but it can actually build new networks and new connections to work around those areas. So we've seen from the research, and this was actually part of my graduate research at BU, that, if you give a patient with aphasia a semantic, word-based reasoning task, and you have an MRI scan of that patient's brain, you're able to see how that patient, is working around it. And other pieces of that patient's brain are actually active that normally wouldn't be responsible for language, but they're taking over and helping out that part of the brain that's been damaged. So the brain's an incredible organ, and, with the right therapy and the right opportunity, patients really can continue to make gains for many years after a stroke. There's that whole myth out there that you only have 1 year, and that's just not true. We've seen that over and over again in the research. I have patients who are 15, 20 years post-stroke who are still making amazing gains.
And
I'm glad you didn't say the word, because Dave and I don't like saying that.
we're at the beginning of our 3rd season of the No Stroke Podcast, Jordyn, and we have a problem with that word as well. So I'm glad. And I just have to, that was a really great description for our listeners and there was a term that you mentioned, primary progressive aphasia. And I wasn't familiar with that term until recently in the news. Bruce Willis, right? That's what the diagnosis in his case, correct?
That is, it sounds like, I don't know that anyone's used that specific term that I've read, but it sounds like that may be the case.
Okay. Can you mentioned BU, can tell us a little bit about your connection and how you're in your office, and we'll get to your private practice after, since you mentioned BU, Is that where some of your work or your connections with constant therapy started?
Yep, absolutely. So I came from the BU aphasia lab, so did constant therapy. And so constant therapy actually was created by a group of incredible technology experts, including, there were 4 co-founders, Vera, Mahendra, Asan, and then Dr. Swathi Kiran, who's the head of the BU aphasia lab. And that's kind of where constant therapy came from, is that, this group of great tech minds came together with great scientific minds and said, how can we, we're watching you guys in the clinic, you're doing a lot of things with paper. Like, there has to be a more efficient way to do this, rather than, you guys having to pull out all the pictures and flip through your notebooks and your paper. There's got to be a better way to do this. And so they came up with creating a program on an iPad. And, they worked through that. They said, oh, there's going to be too many files on this iPad. It's going to clog up the whole iPad. Let's bring in some cloud computing to this too, because that was what a lot of their backgrounds was in as well. And so from there, it's funny, they put the app up on the App Store so that the BU lab could download it. And then they had random people contacting them saying, hey, how do I get a login? And so I think at that point they said, oh gosh, okay, this really is a need. Let's do this for real. Let's create a company and go for it. And that was 8 years ago. And now we have, we're getting close and closer and closer to 1 million users who have worked with constant therapy over the years. So it's been great to see the app grow and the company grow over time.
Yeah, that's a fascinating kind of origin story, and cool that you were there from the beginning. So
I wasn't there quite at day one. I was like about a year later.
Yeah, well, you're the guinea pig to say when they're looking at, again, your workflow and saying, all right, how could this be more efficient? Like, how could they help you? So, and now you're there, and we'll get to your role and exactly what you're doing with them. But before that, like, can you talk us through, like, when these folks were obviously reaching out, right? There's a need out there for more access to therapy. And you mentioned kind of the neuroplasticity aspect of it. And we talk a lot about repetition within, whether it's, recovery from in physical, you're trying to getting your steps in, or PT, OT. Same applies for this, right? So when therapy happens, like, can you talk us through like what a normal therapy session looks like on this application?
Yeah, you bet. So maybe I'll give you a little background of what kind of traditional speech therapy looks like. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what how constant therapy can kind of amplify and augment that. So with typical speech therapy, often it's about once a week for about an hour. That's kind of generally the standard of care. And where things get tricky though, and, I know we're probably going to come talk about this at some point, but, in terms of barriers to getting that therapy, there are a lot of barriers out there, which is very unfortunate, because these patients we know can continue to benefit from therapy, but often they've either geographically, they just don't have access to a speech therapist. There's a huge, backlog of patients who need therapy, but there just are not enough speech language pathologists out there to provide that therapy, and especially in more rural areas. And, the cost is a huge component too. If a patient doesn't have a steady job and they're relying on Medicaid or Medicare, often there's therapy caps. Even with a more traditional commercial insurance plan, there's going to be therapy caps that you run into. And then what do you do, right? So in a traditional speech therapy setting, I would be there to work with the patient. We would problem solve, check in on how things are going. And usually I actually end my sessions with working on making sure the patient has their home exercise program ready to go. And for a lot of my patients, that program is constant therapy, because I, as the clinician, am able to see what that patient has actually done in the week or so since I've seen them. I can look at their accuracy data, their latency, how quickly they're completing tasks, how frequently they practiced. And a lot of my patients, they practiced every day because, again, it goes back to like that access thing. Patients just, I can't be with every patient every day, all day long, nor would they want me there, I think, that much. But I think, it's a matter of getting the therapy into the patient's hands. So when a patient sits down to do constant therapy, they just open up the application, the program on any of their tablet. We work on tablets and mobile phones for Apple, Android, and Amazon Fire. The patient just sits down. All they have to do is hit the start button, and they just go through the therapy that, I as the clinician have laid out for the patient. Or the other great thing is for those patients who don't have access to a speech pathologist anymore, the application actually has some really cool intelligence on the back end called the neuroperformance engine, and it will adjust the difficulty level based on how well the patient's doing. So if they're doing really well, it'll give them something harder. If they're having a hard time, it'll give them something easier. And that's something that patients can have turned on or turned off, even if they're with a clinician too. So honestly, I have the app do a lot of the updates for me because I'm not checking constantly. So we usually find that patients do about 30 minutes at a time of therapy. And we have found, the other cool thing about the app is it gives us this huge repository of data, which we're able to then look at in collaboration with Boston University and say, okay, what conclusions can we draw from this data? Because this is a lot more data than a traditional speech and language research project would usually have. Usually for that, you're looking at like maybe 30 patients in a big study. For this, we're able to really go through and clean the data and look at thousands of patients at once. And, we have that anonymized, de-identified data. So it's not that we're looking at individual patients, it's that group population level analysis that we can do. And so what we found is that about 4 to 5 days a week of about 30 minutes is kind of that sweet spot where you see patients making the maximal amount of improvement over time within the app. So it's great to see the power of big data too that comes out of this. That was probably more than you really bargained for in asking that question.
No,
Sorry.
I have a quick follow-up question. That's really interesting because I'm comparing it. I'm trying to compare, like, to have those insights is great as a clinician. I'm sure like it's wonderful for you to be able to see, because on the rehab side, I'm trying to compare and say, as they progress, so you mentioned about a 30-minute window, does the volume or the intensity increase as you start to see improvements, or the pace of maybe the questions or the I don't know the best say it, but I'm just trying to compare it to a physical rehab session to a brain training session. And how does that change over time, or does it?
That's a great question. So usually, for one thing, the interesting thing is that each patient is a little bit different, right? Because what may take one patient 5 seconds to do is going to take another patient 5 minutes to do. So, as a clinician, I'm always kind of tweaking the assignments, and the app will work to do that too, to tweak how much it gives a patient at a time. But where, physical therapy might increase the number of reps over time, or maybe the weight and I'm just, this is terrible analogy.
Reps and sets,
but in our app, what we'll end up doing is increasing the difficulty level. So instead of saying, okay, I'm just going to ask you to identify a word that you heard, now let's bump up that difficulty level a bit. Now I'm going to ask you to tell me about a sentence. Now I'm going to ask you to tell me about a longer paragraph. Like, one of our hardest tasks is making inferences from voicemails. And we actually got everybody in the company recorded the voicemails because we really try and make everything functional in the app. So there are a bunch of different voices in there because that's something you have to practice with a voicemail. You never know who's going to call and leave you a voicemail with their cell phone cutting in and out. So we've built that into the app. So it's really a matter of not necessarily increasing reps, but it's increasing that challenge level.
Yeah. So when you, like, your role specifically, right? So there's an interesting, in the last, let's take it to say like 5-6 years, like there's been an growing interest in like digital therapeutics, digital health to come in, right? And David and I were fortunate, and I think you're connected in as well to folks that run the Rehab Tech Summit. So it's like, it's trying to, Lauren Sheehan and some of those folks. So it's an interesting play, and we have a lot of clinicians who listen to us, to our podcast as well. And what we always like to try to touch on is like making that transition, right? So it seems like you've done a really interesting, play within still having clinical practice, but like working within this digital therapeutic product as well. So from a speech and language therapist perspective, like how does someone go about, kind of getting some of that, whether it's experience or kind of confidence to go into a therapeutic company that might be in this space, or Constant Therapy, for instance, if you're hired?
That's a great question. So, for me, what I ended up doing was I was living down in Baltimore and working for an arm of Johns Hopkins, and they actually offered tuition reimbursement. So I said, okay, why not? I'll go back to school part-time. What was I thinking? So I did my MBA in healthcare administration at Hopkins, and it was a great opportunity for me to get to connect and network with a lot of people there. I had already had kind of the background and the connection to constant therapy from the BU aphasia lab. But I think that's a great way to get back into, expanding what you're looking at is, what other educational programs can you do? Maybe not like a whole MBA, but like just other opportunities out there to network and meet people. Because I think that's always, that's how these roles come up, right? Is you happen to talk to the right person who happened to be looking for something, and one thing led to another, and then there you all are. So I think that networking piece is huge. The other thing too is, I think with digital therapy growing and changing over time, I think also just being open-minded and creative about how you do therapy, and being open-minded and creative about who you're talking to, because I think some of the things that we've all taken for granted as the way things work are changing, and they should. I'm a huge tech nerd at heart, so I think to me everything about tech is exciting and everything could somehow connect to technology. But over time, I think we're going to see more and more of how are we going to harness technology and use it to power everything that we do. And there's no reason that rehabilitation science shouldn't be right on that bandwagon.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. Have you, with that said, we're kind of running in the same circles on the tech side, and but have you seen a change in some of the clinicians' behaviors change? Like maybe if you look at the window before the pandemic and now hopefully as we're coming out, like were clinicians seeking you and your team services out when the barrier to being in person was real, or still to some degree? Like, can you talk a little bit about that as sort of telehealth, the adoption of digital?
Absolutely. Well, you said the magic telehealth word. So that's an interesting situation that speech pathology is in right now, because we were given kind of a temporary wave on the fact that Medicare did not allow telehealth for speech therapy. That's still in flux to see where that goes long term. But I will say, I think the pandemic forced so many people's hands, right? It forced our patients' hands. A lot of our patients, we're finding, are much more comfortable with technology now because they wanted to talk to their grandkids. They wanted to talk to their loved ones, and they had to get on technology to do that over Zoom. So, I think both the patients that we see at Constant Therapy and the patients that I see in my practice they're just a lot more comfortable with it, which is, a silver lining of this crazy couple of years we've had here. But the other thing too that I've been really impressed with is clinicians absolutely have been reaching out and looking creatively for ways to, extend their reach. And I think Constant Therapy is definitely something that has helped clinicians to do that, because you think about, I can have my normal teletherapy session, but at the end of my sessions, often I'll give homework. And if I'm a clinician who was used to running off a Xerox copy out of the, workbook for aphasia, I can't do that anymore, right? So I have to either email the patient a PDF, hope they have a printer, maybe they'll do it on the computer, maybe they know how to check their email, maybe they don't, or I can set them up with Constant Therapy. And now not only am I sure that they're going to get that actual home exercise program, but I can also see what they're doing in real time. So for me to be able to track that progress, that's been huge personally for me over teletherapy, but also I know for all of our clinicians that's just really, it's helpful. And, we also have a lot of really helpful reports that are built into the app, so that clinicians can take that data and use it for their documentation. So, having all of that flexibility is really nice from a digital perspective. And I think it's been great to see clinicians really jump on board and get creative and figure it out. And I think that's what we all had to do at the beginning of the pandemic. I had my document camera here, with bigger, we just got creative. Humans are resilient.
And do you see it now, like, you speak to like this clinician group, which obviously is one of the larger entry points to like getting this in a patient's hands, right? Like, unless you have, a savvy caregiver or someone, or a savvy patient enough to be kind of doing the research to find a therapeutic like this. Do you see more success in like, or a barrier coming from like the larger hospital systems? You know, is it hard for, they require like integration with the HR systems and things like that that make things complex? And like,
so it's actually been a really interesting time to be a part of the company, because we're really working, so much of our company is very tech focused. So they're really on top of that tech piece that I would never, we have a chief information officer who's our chief security officer, who thank goodness for Bill, because I don't know how to answer these questions that these big institutions have. And it's great to have that expertise on hand to be able to figure out, what do we need to do? We already were HIPAA compliant before the pandemic, but now with the push for more and more digital therapy offerings from these big institutions, they have big questions, and we're not a big company, but we need to be ready to answer those big questions about exactly what we do with our data, what legal promises can we make about our security. And so we've really been evolving. We've created a new enterprise offering that allows those big healthcare institutions to be able to use us knowing exactly how we do our data and how we keep it safe. And we do. Offering things like session timeout, multi-factor authentication, things that, when we were really focusing more on patients, we were trying to do the opposite of that, right? Because we don't want our patients to get locked out of their account. But now we need to offer those security things to make sure that these big institutions feel comfortable. And so we have been successfully doing that with a lot of big institutions now. And it's been great to see that transition and growth in the company to make sure that we're keeping people safe and keeping their data safe.
It's amazing. As you're growing, I think you spoke about like nearly 1 million users. What's that community like? Do you get to speak with patients often, or are you guys kind of? I know a big thing about these therapeutics, kind of bringing the people together and kind of creating that sense of community. What are you guys doing in that under those lines?
Great question. So 2 things I'll mention for that. One, we have this really great online knowledge center called Brainwire. And we've been working on that for many years now. And we've got this great collection of different blog posts. And, we have patients write some of the blogs. We interview patients, we interview caregivers, we interview clinicians, and we continuously are posting new and interesting information for patients on there. And it's not just about constant therapy, it's about what was one we did recently? We just ironically, right before you guys reached out to me, we just posted one about 8 podcasts to listen to. So we're gonna have to add you guys. But just have fun things like that to make sure that patients, and we send those out via email every week. And so that's one way that we interact with our patients. But really the best way to interact with patients is our customer support line. And we actually offer live customer support to anyone who would like to call. And our customer support specialists are phenomenal. They are super patient. I've worked with them and trained them specifically on how to help patients who have cognitive and communication disorders on the phone, which is something that we started doing really early on. And it was the phone that would ring was Vera's cell phone, one of the founders of the company. And all of us at the beginning took turns answering the customer support lines. And, I helped John from Alaska set up his Wi-Fi, and, it's just a great experience to get to interact with patients like that. And so we have those customer support team members there ready to answer those questions anytime. And we get a lot of that feedback from patients that way and from clinicians, and we're then able to implement it in the app. And let me tell you, we have some patients who were, previously computer programmers, and they have given us such great suggestions over the years that it's a very fun community to be a part of. And we do stay really closely connected. I often present at patient support groups for aphasia support groups, just to let them know about constant therapy and kind of to get a feel for our users. And they also share great feedback with us. So it's a great way to stay in touch with the patient population.
Perfect. So you mentioned something. So you talked a little bit about the AI behind that and the neural performance engine and the technology. You also, from reading a little bit more on your website, you also had something pretty significant in that you were granted FDA breakthrough device designation. Now you're actually, because Mike and I are on the cutting edge, right, Mike? You're actually our third company to receive that. Am I correct? Mike, we had
MedRhythms. Number one.
BCI technology with Neurolutions.
Yeah.
Right? Or they might be waiting for, and if they might correct me if they're listening, along with our other millions of listeners. But can you talk a little bit more about that, Jordyn? Because that's really interesting.
Absolutely. So we have FDA breakthrough designation status for the stroke indication. So really what that means is, the FDA sees great promise, and we are, working collaboratively with them to work towards full FDA approval for patients who have had a stroke using constant therapy. And one of the really exciting things that kind of underpinned that FDA breakthrough status was we completed a pretty large endeavor of a study. It was the first study that was ever done completely virtually that we know of, and we've looked with patients with aphasia. And so, so we had 32 patients who had aphasia. We did everything over Zoom. This was actually right before the pandemic, ironically. And we split those patients into two groups, one group that did constant therapy and one group that did kind of more traditional workbook sheets that are speech and language workbook sheets. And so we then, everybody got check-ins every two weeks, and we did treatment for 10 weeks. And at the beginning and at the end, we gave an assessment battery just to look at, how these patients were performing before and after. And it was a randomized controlled trial. So, really great science there. And what we saw was really phenomenal results for those patients in the constant therapy group. So not only did they make statistically significantly more progress on the Western aphasia battery, which the aphasia quotient, which is kind of a level of how severe your aphasia is overall. And they made that huge gain relative to the group that was just doing the workbook sheets. And in addition to that, it was also clinically significant. So our group out of BU had done a study a while back, kind of looking at the Western aphasia battery and saying, okay, what's the magic number of points of improvement on the aphasia quotient that really translate to clinical significance, to where you're really seeing it in your day-to-day life. And that magic number was 5. The patients in the experimental group made more than 6 points of progress. Wow. So not only was it a huge amount of improvement relative to the workbook group, which made less than 1 point of progress, but it also was just a really cool demonstration to us that these patients can participate in a virtual trial, which is huge because our recruitment for the trial went so much faster than would have gone in person. And it, set us up for really good success even throughout the pandemic.
And was that by intention and design that it was set to be an RCT, or did it happen as a result of the pandemic? It was originally designed that way?
So it was a RCT originally designed, and it was originally designed to be virtual because we wanted to make sure that it was accessible to as many people as possible. And then it happened to be the pandemic right afterwards. And then we all went off to our homes and offices, and 2.5 years later, we haven't gone back.
So what can you give us a little inside look, like maybe what's next for constant therapy? What are you guys thinking about? What's next evolution?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things we're really excited about. One is continuing to, get our enterprise product out there to as many people as possible. That's something we're really excited about because we want to see this in the hands of as many patients as possible. So our big push is looking and thinking creatively about other ways that we can get constant therapy covered for our patient population. And one thing that's super cool is that the VA actually provides constant therapy to their veterans at no cost to the veteran. So we work with a number of VAs across the country to have that set up for them. And we've also continued to push the envelope in terms of how else we can get constant therapy reimbursed, whether it's through different waiver programs in different states, whether it's through Medicare Advantage programs, whether it's through HSAs for more traditional commercial insurance programs. And we're always looking for that. And actually, we're really excited that that President Biden's administration just put out the free Wi-Fi program that they did, which is really great news because our app does need Wi-Fi to run. But there's also a component of that helps to cover devices for patients too. So really just continuing to push the envelope on how do we get this reimbursed in a way where it's not falling to the patients to pay for it. That's one big thing. And then the other thing that is my personal thing that I am very excited about is that we are coming out with a Spanish version of constant therapy later this year. So we're really starting to push that localization effort of saying, We know constant therapy is needed in other languages. Let's make it happen. So we've been working very carefully with clinical experts who are fluent in Spanish to make sure that we're doing this mindfully and doing it in a way where we can really expand this to other languages as well.
That's super interesting, and it's such a big play. You know, when you think about, you know, we were speaking about security before as a big topic, right, for, you know, the application, but then accessibility, right? And when you know, you open that lens, it's, you know, and it's not easy, you know, for a company your size to kind of tick those boxes, but you're right, getting it out there, and I'm glad that's your passion project, because that's certainly needed. But so before I wrap up with a question on every episode that David hands over to me, but I'm going to let David kind of ask any question before that, and then we'll jump into the final question of the evening.
I'd like you to we've talked a lot about constant therapy, and I want to make sure we let folks that maybe in your neck of literally the woods in Lenox, right? Talk a little bit about your private practice, and then Mike, I'll hand over. We upped our game. I actually have, I actually found this cleaning out the basement from when my kids were little. So this is we'll get to the surprise magic wand, but give us tell us a little bit more about where you are in your practice, and we know how we'll have these in the show notes too, but give yourself a shout here too.
Well, thank you. Well, so at my private practice here in Lenox, which definitely is in the woods, I provide speech and language therapy along with another clinician who works with me to patients across the lifespan. So we work with, you know, children who are working on learning to talk and clarifying their speech. We work with kids who have feeding disorders. I like to say that speech pathology is everything from the neck up. So we also do feeding and swallowing. So we also have a couple of voice patients. You know, we really kind of run the gamut. And in addition to that, we offer assistive technology consulting, because that's kind of my other area of interest and expertise is that assistive technology piece. And we do a lot with augmentative and alternative communication, AAC, which is basically, you know, constant therapy is more the therapy of how do we improve your speech and language skills and cognitive skills. AAC is how can we compensate for you right now and help you to communicate in a way that's functional for you. So we really believe in that total communication approach. I don't care if you're using sign or verbalizations or a device or writing. We just want to make sure that people are able to communicate, just because it's a human right that people should be able to communicate their thoughts and needs. So that's the practice. In the beautiful backdrop of the
Thank you for sharing that, and kudos to you. That's great that you're covering the spectrum, and that's fantastic. So Mike, because we want to let Jordyn be able to go home before the day turns to night there behind you on this backdrop, and we do cast this over on YouTube too for our other many listeners, so they get to take that in. But I'm going to hand you over for our podcast listeners, you won't see the high end magic wand. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, David. So yeah, Jordyn, it's been a pleasure. And we usually like wrapping up the podcast with asking every guest our magic wand question, right? So if we were to hand you a magic wand and you could redesign the stroke care pathway, what would that look like to you?
Well, that I had a magic wand. And thank you guys for having me. It's really been a pleasure. So the one thing that I would design, I think I would want to make sure that patients and their caregivers had like a personal guide to walk them through the stroke recovery process, because it is so hard and complicated to know, what do you want? What do you need? Who can give it to you? Where can you find it? I mean, I can't even imagine if it were someone who didn't have the background, you know, that I had. If a loved one had a stroke, I don't even know where you would begin, right? You know, our healthcare system is often disjointed, and I think it's tough to find exactly what you need. And you know, those resources shouldn't just be, you know, annual checkup with your neurologist. It should be the physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, the mental health therapy. There's actually, I'll get my own little plug in here for a favorite group of mine. Stroke Onward is an awesome group who are up. I see David applauding, who are really helping to bring awareness to the mental health side of recovering and, you know, living with a stroke, and how do you redefine your identity after that? And I think it's something we don't talk about enough. And I would love to have more mental health professionals who are specialized in that. And gosh, I love collaborating with mental health therapists. They're incredible resources. But I think having that guide of a person or a system to walk you through, knowing what questions to ask and what supports are out there, I think that would be my magic wand.
It's a nice answer. Care navigation, and you see it in oncology happening. There's some, you know, some folks doing that, right?
Exactly. I think we gotta do that with stroke rehab as well.
Great answer, and true, spot on. And you know, what we try to do on this show is do that in our small little way, is just expose the audience to organizations that you're a part of too, and mentions, and that way it just creates, you know, whether it be for the caregiver finding out through someone that's in a support group said, hey, you know, I heard you talking about this, there's a technology for that. And it's like Mike said, we're a little bit more coordinated in other areas, and that's something that hopefully be able to change in the not too distant future. So thank you so much for your time with us this evening. It was just so great to meet you.
Likewise to both of you. This has been wonderful.
And tell the listeners, actually, when we jumped on, how easy it was for you to not mix up our names this evening.
So my husband's name is Mike. His brother's name is David. So it was very easy for me to continuously say Mike and David throughout this podcast.
Perfect. Nice. And just before you head off, you know, if folks are interested in learning more about your private practice or constant therapy, what's the best place for them to reach out to you and have a conversation?
Absolutely. So definitely check out our website at constanttherapy.com. That's an easy one. And my private practice website is piercespeech.com. So straightforward and simple. And again, with constant therapy, you know, I can't say it enough. Don't hesitate to call the customer support line. They are absolutely ready to help, and they're super patient and helpful and kind and just lovely. Madison, Tiffany, Taryn, and Melissa are the four who answer the phone. So it's a real person who will answer, and they will help.
Perfect. With that said, we're going to sign off for the No Stroke podcast and our special guest this evening, Jordyn. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike and David.
Thanks,
have a great evening.